Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Water Talk this afternoon, organized by the Water Institute. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon Professor Kevin Boyle. Kevin is professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics and founding director of the program in real estate at Virginia Tech. He also serves on the US EPA Science Advisory Board on Environmental Economics. Professor Boyle is an international leader in the estimation of values for environmental resources that have no market prices. He has worked on the development and improvement of economic valuation methods used to measure non-market values and to elicit public preferences for environmental change and conservation. And this includes stated preference methods like continued valuation and choice modeling, and revealed preference methods such as hedonic and travel cost models. His work is until today very influential worldwide. Professor Boyle wrote one of the most widely used manuals on non-market valuation, called a primer on non-market valuation, published by Springer in the Netherlands. And in the early 2000s, he also edited a book on the economic value of water quality, together with colleagues John Bergstrom and Greg Poe. I used his work when I just started in this field myself, especially his work on continued valuation in the early days with Richard Bishop, and later following the NOAA guidelines in 1993 after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Actually, Kevin co-authored already a report on measuring non-use damages using continued valuation in 1992, a year before the influential NOAA guidelines were published related to the same topic. And I'm very proud of the fact that we worked together earlier this year on a new set of contemporary guidelines on state preferences research that was published in the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics. So today, Kevin is going to talk about the overview of the work that he did on valuing environmental damage, with special reference to the BP oil spill in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. Please join me in giving Kevin a warm hand of applause.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the nice introduction, Roy. Can everybody in the back hear me okay? I speak softly, so I need the microphone. Well, flying into Toronto and coming over yesterday, I felt very comfortable. I grew up on the Maine-New Brunswick border, and now I live in Virginia, and I love that. But the landscape and the trees and stuff are not quite the same, and I kind of felt at home driving over here. So it's nice to be here. The title is a little bit different from what I gave to Roy early on, because when I went to put it on the slide, it wouldn't fit. It was too long, but it's still the same talk. And so, but just disclaimer, views expressed do not necessarily reflect Exxon, State of Oklahoma, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the US Department of Justice. And in full disclosure, I'm going to talk about 4 natural resource damage cases, and I've worked on 3 of the 4 of them. I worked for Exxon on the Exxon Valdez. I was an advisor to the CO offices on that one. And then the next one we go to is Montrose chemical spill in California. I did not work on that one. Oklahoma Poultry, I was an advisor to the attorneys that were running the litigation. And then for the BP oil spill, I was part of the team for NOAA and the Department of Justice that estimated the damages there. But this is my opinions, my summary as I go down through. And I guess, I realized we're going to have a mixed audience, so I tried to mix it up. But it's a story about environmental insults when there's large environmental accidents that affect environmental quality. Talking about and linking that to government policies and regulations. Ecology, the ecological effects of it. Economics, trying to measure the value of those ecological changes in dollars. Law, because these have gone to court. Politics, because politics comes in and it affects what the outcomes are. It's not just science-driven or law-driven. And it's a slippery, slidey road, as you'll see as we go down through of how each of these ones have played out in terms of actions and policy. So just to kind of step back, I told Roy I was thinking I should understand Canadian law a little bit more before I came up here, and I've been really busy, and I apologize I didn't do that, but I'll tell you a little bit about the U.S. one. When there's a large environmental accident, there's a natural resource damage assessment to restore the environmental resources that have been damaged. And what this is there are many claims that come into, but this is just to make society whole for the environmental effects. So, you know, for example, when there was the Exxon Valdez oil spill, there was effects on commercial fishing. And Alaska shut down commercial fishing because they didn't want anything on the market to give an implication that the salmon was blemished. That's a private claim, the loss to the fishers. I'm not going to talk about that part. In the BP oil spill, there were workers who were killed, and the families filed wrongful death claims. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm only talking about the environmental ones. And in each of these, there are trustees, and the trustees are the federal government agencies, the states, and any Native American tribes that are affected by the oil spill. So in the Exxon Valdez, it was only one state, but it was multiple federal agencies that were involved in the case. In the BP oil spill, you'll see there are multiple states that were affected because you have Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida that all had effects. And when you're doing these damages, it's a challenging thing for economists to do because we're trying to get the value for the public, and the public has a property right in the uncontaminated state, but the uncontaminated state is damaged. And you know, our goal is to make the public whole, and it's what we're trying to get at is the maximum amount of money the public would pay to avoid that damage, so that they're indifferent between paying that money and having the incident occur. Okay? Now, you could say, since they have a property right in the uncontaminated state, shouldn't it be, what would they accept? You know, shouldn't they be compensated? Well, we're trying to get a measure of that through how we do it, but there are problems in terms of measuring willingness to accept in a long literature, whereas willingness to pay is much more valid as a measure, and we could make a logical argument that what we have is a minimum lower bound estimate when we go that way, whereas if we did willingness to accept compensation, we would have an overestimate. And what we're looking at is loss use, and the lost use here would be recreation use of the resources, fishing, recreational boating, beach use, and lost non-use values, and are sometimes called passive use. And non-use is the value that you would place on a resource even if you never intended to use it, but you feel some loss because the resource has been damaged, and what you would pay for that resource to not be damaged. The non-use is the largest part of the damages in all of these cases, and the recreation value is the smallest part. So if we think about this, and I'm not sure how well this pointer works, it does a little bit. So this is just a stylized example here, we can think about it, but at this point in time, the resource, what we call 100%, and we have an accident that causes resource quality to decline, and at some point natural recovery takes place. This example assumes that natural recovery brings it back to pre-contamination conditions. That doesn't always occur, but just for the stylized example, that's what we're assuming. And then you can do recovery actions that speed up the resource recovery. And there's two types of things that are thought about here. One is what you would pay to avoid. And so what we're trying to do is trying to avoid, the measure we're trying to get is the value of this whole area right here. And what happens is if the company that the responsible party has done any restoration, then that is netted out of the damage payment that they have to pay. This amount up here is if we didn't do a monetary restoration, but we did compensatory restoration. This area right here is just equal to this area right here. And so there would have to be other restoration that's done to compensate for this interim loss that could not be recovered by the restoration effects. But what I'm going to be talking about today is how we get the monetary value of that area here, and I'll talk a little bit about compensatory restoration at the end of the talk. And I don't mind questions as we go along, if that's okay, Roy. So when we're measuring economic damages, lost use is measured by recreation demand models, and you take the trips that people make to recreate and the cost of those trips, and that we use that to estimate the relationship between how much they pay and the trips they make, and that can give us an economic value of the value of trips to the area. And so if there's an oil spill like the BP oil spill and they shut down all activities along the beaches, then that full value of a trip is lost, and you can measure it that way. Or you can use stated preferences, where you go out and do a survey approach and ask people questions that help reveal their values. The recreation demand approach can only get lost use values. And so what I'm going to talk about is stated preferences, where we can measure loss, use, and non-use, or what we refer to as total value. And then back at the bottom, I'm talking about large cases. A lot of the small cases actually just do habitat equivalency analysis, going back to this, where they just look at compensatory restoration. The larger ones are the ones where you measure the economic damages, and that's where I'll be talking. So stated preference surveys, they're a survey-based approach. And when you do it, you have to define a baseline level of resource conditions pre-injury, the 100% in that graph I showed you. And then you need to do the change in services due to the injury, how they were diminished and diminished through time. You need to describe a plan to restore those services, including the timing of when that restoration will occur. And this is a little bit different from what I told you in the graph, because this plan has to be one where you can convince people that you're going to do full restoration. This will bring it back to being whole. You need to describe a method of payment that's credible and enforceable, and then you have to have a mechanism for eliciting preferences. There's what we call incentive compatible. People have the incentive to give you a truthful response, and that's typically framed as a choice. And I'm going to go through the Exxon Valdez, and then the Montrose, and then the Oklahoma Poultry, and then the BP. I'm going to do a little bit more detail on the Exxon Valdez to show you how some of these elements are put in practice, but I'm not going to repeat them for the other ones because they follow the same pattern. They're just customized to each of the specific applications. The one thing that we have to do and worry about in this is what's called the time traveler problem. So this is a picture of a Gulf of Mexico marsh before the spill, and this is a picture of the same marsh after the spill. And so these studies are done after an accident has occurred. And you can't say to a person in a survey, what would you pay so that this would not happen, because it's already happened. And so you have to frame it in terms of what would you pay to avoid another accident that would have the same injuries as this one. And so in the Exxon Valdez one, the way to talk about that is we could say over a certain period of time, the likelihood or the probability of another ship accident would be in a certain period of time, there'd be certainty that there would be another ship accident. Or in the Gulf of Mexico, over a certain period of time, there'd be certainty that there'd be another platform spill. So we can frame it that there would be another one coming, and that's the way we address this time traveler issue as we go along in designing the studies. So the Exxon Valdez, picture of some of the cleanup there, happened March 24th, 1989. Nearly 1 million US gallons were spilled. largest oil spill in U.S. coastal waters at the time. And just some of the backstory, I was hired by Exxon to work on this project. One of the people from the corporate offices flew up. I was at the University of Maine at the time, flew up and met with me in a conference room at a hotel to convince me to go to work for Exxon. I was just a year out of graduate school at that time, and I was like, what do you want me? I'm just an assistant professor. What I didn't know at the time is there's a lot of backroom trading that goes on. And Exxon had a really well-known economist from the University of Washington, Gardner Brown, working for them. And after a short period of time, they wanted nothing more to do with Gardner. And then Exxon hired 2 environmental economists from the University of Rhode Island. They didn't want to work with them anymore. And so they did a trade. In that trade, Exxon said, this is not enough compensation to us. We want sole rights to negotiate with Boyle, and no one else but us. No state, no federal government can negotiate with him. I didn't know this until afterwards. So the only one that would talk to me was Exxon. And I called some senior people, and they said, you know, this is the biggest thing, you've got to get involved. So I got involved with working for Exxon in this case. Just in going on, it's a remote, scenic, biologically productive body of water. And you know, one of the things that Exxon executives kept asking throughout the whole case was, if a tree fell in the forest and no one knew that the tree had fallen, how could there be any loss? You know, this kind of metaphor. And so they say the same thing as they said, you know, most people in the U.S. never even knew that there was oil being traveled through this area, the resources, so there was no damage. Exxon never did a valuation study. In these types of cases, the responsible party never wants to put a number on the table. It's not to their advantage. They're reacting to the ones that the plaintiffs put on, and so the federal government put a claim on. So my job was to explain economics and value and explain to them what the perhaps flaws would be in the federal government case. The extent of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, this Valdez is up here. The ship was coming down. It grounded right there shortly afterwards, and this is just the flow of oil coming down along the Gulf of Alaska. And so we're right up in this area up here. And so Kodiak Island there, Kodiak Island here. And so it covered a fairly extensive area, the most extensive area of any oil spill in the U.S., and also the most pristine. The other ones that were well known were ones that were the Arthur Kill in New Jersey, heavily area of shipping with a lot of background contamination at the same time, and then the Nestucca spill in Washington, which was obviously a cleaner area than New Jersey, but not as pristine as this area. This is, I told Roy my slides are available for anybody, and so each of these I put in citations to the studies so that if anybody wants any information on them, you can get them afterwards. But there is an interesting thing here, is you can see that the report was published in 1992. The article was published almost a decade later. And one of the challenges in the economics literature is that if you're going to publish, you need to have something that's new theoretically, new methodologically. When you do a case for litigation, you try to do well-established procedures that have been validated and reliable. You don't want to be doing something that's innovative. And so the authors had a hard time getting this through the review process. And somebody who's the editor of Environmental and Resource Economics that Roy and I know well said, this ought to be a published study and it'd be highly citable, and was more willing to accept it in Environmental and Resource Economics. But they did have a hard time publishing it, even though they did a state-of-the-art study at the time. So the plan that you have to have, I'm going to kind of go through the pieces that I talked about in the stated preference study. So this one, the plan that was used in the study was to have 2 Coast Guard ships that would guide each ship in and out of the port. So the guide ships would reduce the probability of a grounding, but also in the event that there was a grounding, the guide ships would have the trained people and resources to immediately respond to the spill. Now, this was put into play. This was actually something that was being used in other countries. Other countries have typically been more advanced than the U.S. sometimes in their responses. So it wasn't something that was just made up, and it was something that was used afterwards. And so this was the way that in the survey they described to people the program that they would be paying for that would prevent a similar spill occurring again. The next thing is you have to do is tell them the information on baseline injuries. And so this one has the bird species affected, has the number of deaths, and it has their pre-spill populations. So this was given to the respondents to describe the injuries. There's a lot more information in these surveys. There's pictures of damaged and undamaged resources. I'm not going through all of that. I'm just going through the summary information. So they were given the baseline and changes for injured bird species, and they were also given the same information for injured marine mammals, even showing ones that did not have deaths, but there were some injuries documented to them. So they could have been oiled, but they didn't necessarily die, at least in the short run. And then also fish. And one thing I want to say is this comes back to one of the messages I'm going to come back to. But in this one it says, because most of the oil floated on the surface of the water, the spill harmed few fish. Okay, so basically they were being told that there were no fish injuries. But let me come back to that a little bit, because it's hard to describe all the injuries that go on. The payment, it has to be a binding payment. So the payment that they had was a one-time tax that would be added to federal taxes so that everybody would pay it. Now this is a challenge in the U.S. because only about 40% of the people in the U.S. actually pay federal income taxes after you think about deductions. So you might hear a lot of discussion in the news about changing the tax code, but a lot of people don't pay any federal income tax at all. So it has to be, it's one time as a special charge so that we could get everybody thinking that you're going to have to pay it. You're not going to avoid it with deductions and other things. There was also something that they put in about the oil companies would pay a one-time tax. One of the things in these studies is you always have a group of people that say that the companies should pay. But even if the companies pay, then they're going to have reduced profits. They're going to pay less taxes to the government, so there's going to be less services to the people. Or it's going to increase the prices that they charge, so people are going to pay more. If you trace it all the way through, the public still pays one way or the other. But we want to know what individual values are, so it needs to be framed in a way that people will give you their values. Then the valuation question was asked as a vote, whether they'd vote for or against the program. Having it as a vote is critical because it's been shown theoretically and empirically to be the incentive-compatible format for people to answer these questions truthfully. And there's also another element that comes into play in that the choice has to be consequential. People have to believe that there's a probability that the answer they give could actually affect policy. It doesn't have to be 100%, but there needs to be a probability. And people in the U.S. are quite familiar with referendums, and it's easy to convey that the vote can be informative and affect decisions. And there's a lot of other things that go in. With these studies, they get a pre-letter from NOAA or the Department of Justice telling them that the information is going to be used. And then people got various dollar amounts, 10, 30, 60, or 120. So those are randomly assigned to people. And the combination of the yes-no votes and the dollar amounts is how we use to statistically estimate the value that people place on the change. So the valuation results, in-person interviews. That way you can convey a lot of complicated information to people. Probability sample of residents in the 50 United States and the District of Columbia. 1,600 households were selected, and there was a 75% estimate. There are two estimates that were done. The first one, the Turnbull estimate, was done in the original study. The Weibull, the estimation of procedures that improved through time, was done in the journal article. The Turnbull is a non-parametric lower bound estimator because all high values are trimmed from the estimation. So you can think of this as being a conservative lower bound. The Weibull estimator is more representative of the potential distribution. And so the damages came out to be about 4.8 or about $5 billion or $7 billion were the estimated damages that would compensate U.S. citizens for the losses from the oil spill. And this is total value, includes use and non-use values. There were two claims in this one. Alaska is a pretty independent state. And rather than doing a collaborative claim, which is often done where all the trustees get together and do it, Alaska had their own case against Exxon, and then the federal trustees had a separate one. Well, in the middle of all the assessment, a former governor of Alaska, Hickel, was reelected to be governor of Alaska. And this is my words from what I understand how the conversation went, but Hickel said, oil is the lifeblood of our state. We need to get over this and get done. And so Hickel settled the case. Because in US courts there can't be double jeopardy, that meant that the federal case was also settled. And so it was settled for $900 million and a 1 million reopener. So anywhere from about 25% to a seventh of the damages. The 100 million reopener is all of these settlement cases have reopener clauses. So if farther down the road additional injuries are identified that couldn't be identified at the time of the settlement, there's funds that could come forward and do that. And so there was 100 million for a total of 1 million. And usually what companies do is they purchase an annuity that is available to cover these damages. So 25 years later, from the Exxon Valdez, we're a little bit beyond that, but this is the closest assessment. This gives us, it says, the top ones are the recovered species. And then we've got recovering species and habitats, so still have some. We have some that others that are farther along, and then some that are status unknown. And so when we're looking at that trend, you can see that the recovery trend varies with different species. It's not all the same. But also that, essentially people were told that there was no fish effects. And you can see that, dolly varden, sockeye salmon, pig salmon, cutthroat trout, rockfish, herring are still down here. So there were fish effects. And so if you think about the estimate, it didn't capture all of the injuries. And one of the reasons is when you're doing this, you may not have all the scientific information on the injuries to move forward with, and the valuation part can only move forward with what there is known information available. There's also challenges in terms of eliciting people's values for all components. And so if you think about the sediments, intertidal communities, those are more difficult to convey to people in surveys. So whenever you think about these, really the estimates that are coming out are lower bound estimates. So the outcomes of it, that this is long enough ago, so there have been outcomes. There was an impetus to re-examine state and federal policy in terms of oil spill response, and the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was a key element. And one of the things that this did is it set aside a fund of money in case the responsible party was bankrupt and no longer in business, that there would be funds for restoration and a number of other features. And then the International Marine Organization phased out single-hull tankers by 2010. And so the Exxon Valdez was a single-hull tanker, so when they ran into the reef, they breached the tanks where the oil were and caused the spill. This is a double-hulled tanker here that ran into a submerged platform in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see with a double hull, there was no spill from this one. There was damage to the tanker, but there was no oil spill. So the double-hull tanker was a key change in how oil is transported. In the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of defunct platforms are sunk and they're used as artificial reefs for fishing and what have you. And so there's a number of them, and this ship happened to run into one of them. I'm going to switch gears now to Montrose. It's an NRDA. This is not a one-time accident, but it's long-term contamination. 1940s through the 70s, DDT and PCBs were discharged into the ocean near Los Angeles. They affected bald eagles and peregrine falcons. They also caused California to issue fish consumption and bag advisories for certain types of recreational and commercial species. And the chemicals still contaminate the marine environment Southern California by today. So this one, if you look at it, it's Montrose case because Montrose manufacturer of DDT was the largest one. But the plant was here. There were other industrial plants with the PCBs here. And what they ended up being is in stormwater discharge that came out, and their outlets were into the Pacific Ocean that caused the area of damage here. So you can see the red is the highest area of damage or injury, and then the currents are bringing it north along the coast. So injured species, bald eagles, peregrine falcons, fish were white croaker and kelp bass. Litigation outcome, the valued injuries didn't match the documented injuries. In litigation in the US, there's depositions first because there can't be any surprises in the court case. So they deposed it was the federal government in the state of California that brought this case against Montrose and the other companies. And when they did the depositions, the economists said one thing and said our damages are based on this. They had biologists on the stand. The biologists said, well, there's no credible evidence to support them. And so when that happened, they did what's called a Daubert challenge, and the judge ruled that the economic damages do not fit the injuries on the case, and so it was excluded and not put in. And one of the reasons for this is a lot of court cases, the lawyers put up Chinese walls between the different experts, so you don't talk directly to them. They pass the information from one expert along to another expert. That's a key thing I think that happened in this case. I didn't work on it, but as I understand, is that it was more a mistake by the attorneys of not having good information translated between the biological experts and the economic experts that led to it. But this study ended up with a loss of about $575 million. The case was settled for $73 million. So, you know, less than a sixth of the total damage. The next one is Oklahoma poultry case. This is one, it's been going on, but it's an ongoing one. There's been, and I know the same hasn't been in Canada, but you know, there's been a lot of concentration in the poultry industry in the U.S. You know, they moved to Delaware, Maryland, Oklahoma. There's certain places where there's very heavy poultry operations, and they're what they're called integrators. So Tyson's or Purdue or the other ones really control the whole delivery chain from feed, treatment, and everything up. And so here, Oklahoma has a wild and scenic river, the Illinois River, that flows down into 10-Killer Reservoir. And so everything there is flowing down from Arkansas, and this is the heavy poultry area. And so the non-point runoff was causing eutrophication in the Illinois River and 10-Killer Lake. And so this is a case where Oklahoma sued the poultry industry in Arkansas for the damages to the Illinois and Lake 10-Killer. And this one, the method of doing it that they did was treating the river and the lake with alum. And basically what they did is predict what the recovery time would be natural and how much the alum treatments would reduce the recovery time for the river and then for the lake. So about 40 years quicker for the river and about 40 years quicker for the lake. Longer in the lake because the sediments and everything have accumulated there. In this case, the economic valuation was excluded, but for an entirely different reason. The judge ruled that the state of Oklahoma needed to include the Cherokee Nation as a co-plaintiff in the case. And so he excluded the study. The Cherokee Nation signed an affidavit and said they would become a co-defendant, and they had accepted everything that had been done. And the judge did not accept it, so that's not enough. Probably did not want the case to go forward. They did file for injunctive relief for the alum treatments to start, and that was appealed, and it's still pending, and the judge has never made a decision on it. One thing that, you know, this is just my interpretation, but, you know, different things happened, but, you know, you had different attorney generals come in Oklahoma, and they probably had different incentives of how much they wanted to pursue this case. So it is still sitting there, and nothing has been done in terms of damages or in terms of protecting or restoring the river and lake. Last one is the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and that was April 2010, about 210 million U.S. gallons spilled, much bigger than the Exxon Valdez, the largest one ever in the U.S. Not the largest in the world, but the largest in the U.S. And you're probably familiar with it, but there was an explosion because of the pressure when they were connecting to the pipeline, caused the fire and caused the spill. So Gulf of Mexico, just some resource like the Exxon Valdez. It's the 9th largest water body in the world, teems with sea life, unexplored deep water corals. I didn't even know that there were deep water corals until I got going in this. I'm an economist, not a biologist, so that was interesting to me. And it has the coastal wetlands in the U.S. And you think about the resource value of coastal wetlands, and half of them in the U.S. are where they are. It's pretty important. This case was a lot different, though, from the Exxon Valdez one that was in basically a pristine area. The Gulf of Mexico has a lot of environmental problems already in there. We have all the nutrients coming down the Mississippi River, all the shipping, all the oil, and there's also natural oil seeps in the Gulf of Mexico where oil just naturally comes up that affects it. The extent of the oil spill, this was a spill, but it affected the wetlands along Louisiana, and then it went up and affected the beaches along Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Gulf shores are here. These are really popular beaches, and these are really important wetlands. And then it came out into the Gulf, and there were some separate pieces that were identified as well. Just the publication, we got this published in Science earlier this year that has a summary of the injuries. Here, the baseline information was the animals and ecosystems of the Gulf of Mexico. We also had to talk about recreation. We had to tell people that we were not including businesses. We really had a challenge in designing this, that people wanted to include the private effects. And so not businesses, not deaths, not catching fish, not shipping, not drilling for oil. We had to dissuade people of that. But we also had to own up that there were past effects of pollution in the ecosystem, and we're only talking about the net effects of the oil spill given the pollution that was already there. The process of doing it, well, this was something that's being done in Norway, is when you drill for oil, you do 2 platforms. And so this is the main one. And at the second time, you drill a second platform that connects into the pipe. And what happens is if you have an accident here with a blowout, like happened in the BP one, then you can divert the oil up through here, and you only have a very small spill in the transition period. And so this was the program that we asked people to pay for, that they would be paying to avoid another oil spill in the Gulf. The injuries, we did 2 injuries here, and the injuries that we did for 2 were partly because of this uncertainty about the injuries. One being that what could be proved with certainty at the time that this might go to court, and what were the likely injuries that could be documented with more time, and then the other ones were more uncertain, were not listed. So we had a small one. Those were the certainty ones. The birds with 50,000 died, 5 years recovery was in the small one. Marshes, oil on 185 miles of marshes, 3 years recovery. Going to the beach, 10 million fewer times, one year recovery. And then the snails, young fish, young sea turtles, bottlenose dolphins, deepwater ones, are ones where there was some evidence, but the scientists had not confirmed them. So we had a larger set of injuries that were available, depending on the time that they would actually go to court. Because when you have these cases, if they go to court, they're a long time after you do the studies. And so what we were trying to do was bound what might be known at the time that the cases go to court. Valuation, and again, in-person interviews. Random sample of U.S. households only in the contiguous U.S. We didn't do Alaska and Hawaii. And at least one English-speaking adult. This has become more and more of an issue with immigration into the U.S. And we didn't have the resources to do translation real-time at all the different ones. Larger number, 3,656 completed interviews for a 48% response rate. So the small injury had about $15 billion in damages. The large injury, we estimated the injuries at about 17.2. So the litigation outcome, April 4th, 2016, the federal government settled for $8.8 billion. If we go back and compare that to the small one, it's about half the large injury, a little bit more than half of the small. When you compare these, though, you have to realize that BP was given credit for restoration that they'd already done, and BP was pretty aggressive with the restoration that they'd done. So you wouldn't necessarily expect that the settlement would be exactly the same amount as the injury. So just some concluding comments to wrap up the things that are really challenging when you start out is quite often in many of these cases the baseline conditions are not known. And I know that I was talking to graduate students in economics and they were talking about how difficult it is to collect data in Iran and because of the situation. Well, even though in the US we have lots of natural resource data, the baseline conditions still may not be documented that will tell you what's in a specific location, a specific situation. They may be too general or not studied. There's also the real-time science versus real-time decision making. When you have something like this, there's real-time science that goes on and it's funded. It takes time to do that and explore and document these things. But the decision-making is moving at a much quicker pace. And they set the biologists, the ecologists, the oceanographers all to work. All of us start work at the same time. And we're, as economists, we're being expected to put together something that estimates damages that the other experts are just exploring at that same time. So there's a challenge there doing it. There's also a challenge of the touch points between ecosystems and economics. There's been a lot done in recent years about ecosystem valuation, but how do you translate what's done in ecology, biology, oceanography, and translate it to economics? There's still a huge gap of communication between them in terms of putting them together for damage issues. The Chinese wall between experts always is a challenge, and sometimes they don't even let some of the economists talk to other economists. They have their experts partitioned off. The valuation results, you see that you know, you could say, well, how come the valuation results weren't there in the end, and how come excuse me, the settlements weren't exactly equal to the damages? Well, the first thing to know is that economics is just one thing that goes into these decisions. It's not the binding decision. But the other issues that I talked to you above all create challenges. In the BP negotiations, a lot of the science between the physical injuries was uncertain. And so if it went to court, BP would have been challenging the weakest leg of the stool going afterwards. And so if they could undercut, you know, some of the injuries, you know, from a biological or physical science perspective, they could undercut the case. And so there's kind of a tension on both sides and an incentive to settle, because from an industry side, they don't want a jury to give them a huge damage assessment. On the trustees' side, they don't want to take the risk of it getting thrown out and not getting anything. And if I think the valuation results do anything, is that they're a lever in negotiations, that there is some measure to go out there that can be used in court to inform the decision maker. And that pushes towards the responsible parties agreeing to payments. And the other thing is kind of ability to measure all elements of the damages. You can't describe everything in the survey for a number of reasons. One, it could get too long. The other is it may be too complex for people to understand. And the third is it may be things that people just don't think about. On the other hand, the questions are asking people, how much would you pay to avoid all injuries? And so even though they're not all described, people are being asked to value preventing all injuries. And so that's a level of uncertainty. And you know, one of the approaches used for small spills is habitat equivalency. How much would it cost to provide equivalent habitat to what was lost? That's used in smaller cases. I don't think it's either or. I think they're complementary things. But habitat equivalency is used a lot in cases, but it has not been validated, whether it's valid and reliable, the way valuation has. There's still a lot to be understood there in terms of how costs are developed, and then the equivalency metrics that are used. But I think of them as two complementary approaches and not as competitive ones. And just thank you. And even though we have remedies that we talked about for each of them, and they've been put in place, this is from October 14th, oil spill in Gulf twice as big as first reported. There's another oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Roy was surprised to hear it with the hurricane and the fires in California and other things going on around the world. It probably has not hit the news. It's not a BP type spill, but there is another large oil spill right now in the Gulf. So accidents are going to continue to happen, and these issues that in terms of how we measure damages so that we can provide restoration are going to continue to be important. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We have time for questions. Oh, one second, because we're taping it.
Can you hear me okay, or do I need a...
I can hear you okay.
Okay. So my background is from, not so much from environmental studies or economics. It's mostly from ecotourism and tourism studies. But nonetheless, listening to your talk, really, really interesting. I continue looking for measures, something that can be practically applied to our complex issues. And kind of a joint question that I have for you, have you come across a measure that would include human values, like more of a spiritual or emotional or aesthetic values of these natural environments that we might have, whether First Nations or just general public? And also, if you have come across a measure that would include the valuation of the free environmental services like carbon sequestration or production of oxygen. So 2-in-1 question.
I think that's more than 2-in-1, but I'll try to address them. Maybe going in reverse order. I don't think anybody's figured out how to value oxygen. I mean, you take away oxygen and you know, we've lost life support. And so I think, you know, if you think about it, the value is infinity. That doesn't mean that you can't value some marginal changes in air quality, which is done. There are a number of studies that have valued carbon sequestration from a lot of different perspectives. You know, from valuation, like I talked about, from companies' production functions to labeling of products and what have you. There's a whole area in economics of valuing carbon sequestration on both the consumer and producer side. When we do this, what we're doing is measuring a value based on people's preferences, and those preferences are based on their beliefs and spiritual and everything that they have, and so it's given how they come to form their decisions. All of those things are in the background, but we don't go through and disassemble them to come out with a value to all the different components. I don't think that we could. To do that, from an economic perspective, we'd have to assume that they're all separable. It's a theoretical and a statistical assumption that I don't think would necessarily hold. And even if you take something, let me take a more simple example, and even in markets, people buy orange juice because it tastes good, because it's healthy, because it has vitamin C, because they like the pulp, and we can value it, but we can't tell you how much each one of those ones goes into it. When you go into working with First Nations and others, there is it's not a different approach, the same approach. One of my colleagues in Montana does a lot with Native Americans in the U.S., and he does these same approaches. But how he talks to them and how they put together the story and the choices are different from the way that you did it. For example, in the Oklahoma one, the Cherokee Nation said what we were doing was fine. Then there was another case on the St. Lawrence River where the Onondaga Nation was involved, and I was brought in as an independent one to review what was being done by the Onondaga Nation. Brought me in, and that was a recreation demand one that they were doing, and the Onondaga Nation was fine with how that was being done. But they could not judge it for themselves, so they brought me in to review and help them make recommendations of how things would go in that they thought would compensate their tribal members. I think part of their concern was that restoration that without their participation would not necessarily think about their concerns.
I'll try and formulate a good question there, but your concluding slide was fascinating to me because there's all these uncertainties and challenges of making decisions, and you kind of answered one of my questions about the baseline, but all of those uncertainties, I presume the entity that caused the event exploits those uncertainties to minimize their payment. Would that be a fair? Where there's an uncertainty, it makes it more difficult to come up with a true value. I wonder to what extent that lack of knowledge of baseline or existing status of the system before the event, how big that is compared to some of the other ones as a barrier, and the other, maybe, so that's one question, is that kind of the biggie in your list? And to what extent does the ability of the, what do you call it, the guilty party, the spiller or the event creator, their ability to pay determine what that amount is? They've all obviously got to be thinking about their ability to pay and how they go about negotiations, but it's not a formal part of the process. My experience, I've worked on the responsible party side, I've worked on the trustees side, and I've worked as a neutral in-between party, so I've worked at all three. I mostly work on the trustee side now because I realize it's a lot harder to put together a case. It's pretty easy to tear a case apart because of those uncertainties. I think most trustees believe that they did damage and that they should do something. I don't think that they're out there thinking that they shouldn't. But they have stockholders and others, and just like it's a business decision that they want to minimize the cost of something that they're not getting revenue from. And I think that my experience is that they go for a foundational issue. They don't go for, if you use a house metaphor, that you've got a crack in your plaster. You've got a crack in your foundation. And I don't think it's the same in every single case. I think it varies from case to case. And sometimes the crack is on the physical injury, sometimes it's on the economic, sometimes it's on the legal side. I did a case in Oklahoma that's still going on, and they asked for my testimony to be excluded based on Oklahoma law that had not been changed since colonial times. And the way that law reads is you could only be compensated for a loss if it is immediate and complete. So if we take it to modern times and your neighbor gets mad at you and sets your house on fire and burns your house down, it's immediate and complete and you can be compensated. On the other hand, if your neighbor does something that makes it very unattractive for you to sell your house, and so somebody doesn't want to come in and buy it because of the degraded that's not immediate and complete, even though there's a real economic loss. So they exploited something in Oklahoma law in that one. So I think it really varies from case to case. But if you had to ask me, I think the biggest issue is how quickly you have to move in measuring what are the physical and biological effects. You have to go from day one almost to try and measure those. You know, my daughter is a graduate student in freshwater ecology, and she's going to go do work in Puerto Rico, and they're going to put her in Puerto Rico as soon as it's safe from everything being back online to try and get that information. And that's kind of the same thing here. You got to get in immediately, but they want results immediately, and I think that is the biggest challenge that puts a burden on every single expert and the attorneys in cases.
Time for one more question. Can I ask you a question then, myself?
Sure, but you can't ask me any over dinner then.
Well, very briefly, maybe about the thing that Roland was referring to as well is how do you make people pay for something that someone else is responsible for? So the polluter should pay is often an issue in these kind of survey-based approaches. And can you say maybe a little bit about how much the protest rate was perhaps that you had in your survey? In Exxon Valdez, it was 20%, so one in every fifth respondent refused to pay because they thought the polluter should pay. Was that an issue in your study?
I think our belief is the identifying protest is more complicated than the Exxon Valdez, and everybody that was participated in the Exxon Valdez participated in the BP. We just had a bigger team this time, and the thing is that people could answer a survey, and you could have a number of questions to try and find out whether they're a protest. And they could answer one question and say, oh, it's a protest. And they could answer another question, and it says, oh, their response is legitimate. And there's also judgment they had to do. And so we backed away from doing identification of protests. And what we did is something that we had social psychologists and survey research sociologists on the team, and we did what they call a content validity equation, where we put all of these variables in a regression to predict responses. And so rather than just looking at one saying it's a protest or not, we asked whether their effect was such that we would have a protest. And what we found when we did that is there were protest effects, but what they all did is serve to reduce value. rather than increased value. And so, yes, there was effect. We can't tell you a percentage, and we know that they're there, but all of our statistical results saying that those that are protest led to lower values and contributing to a lower bound.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. I propose we stop the talk. Once again, thanks very much. Let's give Kevin one more round of applause, please.
Thank you.
I have a little token of appreciation for you to come here from the Water Institute.
Okay.
Thanks very, very much.
Thank you. That's nice.
Thank you all for coming. This is just a reminder that at the end of November, the 30th of November, we'll have our next WaterTalk. We'll have John Hardick here. He's a Fulbright scholar in global governance at the Basile School of International Affairs in Waterloo. He's also going to talk about rehabilitation of water systems, and very specifically, he's going to talk about the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge and lessons learned from setting that up. Thank you so much for your attention, and hope to see you on the 30th of November. Bye-bye.
Thank you.